listening to Soren's introduction to you and knowing that I came to know your work also through listening to you reading your books, and then listening to you now and knowing from our conversation that you chose intentionally to lead a meditation. It really was a meditation by teaching. How is it that when some people talk for half an hour and they're teaching, it's an intellectual exercise, and you also are sharing teachings, and yet it's an experience that you've created for thousands here and watching? How are you crossing over from teaching to experience in such a special way?
Well, the words, by being continuously aware of the underlying presence in you, the quality of what your mind produces is enhanced. One could say it is more alive, more powerful, more relevant to this specific moment. So to be in touch with that produces a more empowered or inspiring, fresher way of speaking. Of course, it doesn't only affect speaking, it affects sense perceptions too, because you perceive things also in a fresh way. I enjoy sense perceptions. I enjoy even walking in the street and looking at the multiplicity of people and cars and things going on. But where the real joy comes from, as you perceive, you can sense the underlying presence while you look. And that's the joy. So we could call that the joy of being. So sometimes words come out of it. It's an inner state of connectedness. And the strange experience is although I'm not channeling as such, I have nothing against channeling, but I'm not channeling in the way that my eyes go funny and I say, this is so-and-so talking now.
Not yet.
That's fine too, but I don't feel that I am actually, that the person is not giving the talk. The person becomes an instrument for the consciousness to speak through, and that's all. So that's the reason also I don't know what is going to be said next. So there's no plan. And that's very enjoyable, and this complete surrender to the present moment, the complete surrender to life, to presence. At first it was a little strange to be on stage, and when I started speaking, sometimes my mind came in before coming on stage and said, okay, you should be thinking now, what are you going to talk about? And then, okay, I'm going to start with this, and then I'm going to say that. But then finally I got onto the stage, and most of the time that dissolved. And a few times when I actually did say what I thought I was going to say, it wasn't very powerful anymore.
Then I'm throwing away my questions. Actually, I am.
Very good.
This is what growth looks like, right?
Yes.
Right in front of us. I'm curious about a couple of things that you said, and one of them has to do with story and the relationship between story and self, and how important our stories are, not only in justifying our suffering or soliciting sympathy, but also in helping us in our connectedness with other people. Even when we connected yesterday, we compared what has happened in the time since we saw each other last.
Yes.
So there's something about story that helps us relate and connect.
Yes.
And yet I certainly hear you on story potentially being the layers that prohibit you from actually being
Yes.
in the vertical self, as you
Yes.
were describing. So how do we integrate story in a healthy way into self, particularly in connection to others?
Yes, well, the story is what happened and remembering or talking about what happened, or maybe a shared memory, and that's fine, but it cannot be a substitute for something deeper that is more important, and that is the actual connection between us beyond words and concepts. When I look at you, if I only look at you through our story, that would be very limiting. Even if it's a nice story, but in many cases it's not nice. And of course the stories that are not nice get stuck in the mind much more than the nice stories. The nice stories are, okay, he's a nice person, very nice person. What else can you say? Well, he's so helpful. Okay, and then finally after 2 minutes the mind doesn't say anymore. But if he's an obnoxious person, the mind can think about it for hours. So the stories are fine as long as that we are not confined to the stories, and that so that in the actual moment of interacting, there is another dimension present, and then the stories are fine. And even if the stories, let's say if we met a couple of years ago and we had a pleasant interaction, but let's just imagine that we met a couple of years ago and we had an unpleasant interaction, then if we only remembered our story, that would totally obscure our ability to relate to each other, or there would be just further unpleasantness added to what's already there, which would be stuff in your mind and stuff in my mind. And that stuff tends to proliferate. It produces more and more of the same kind of thoughts. So if even more important to be present with another person, if there's a negative story in your past with that person, so to look at another human being, so that the transcendent dimension needs to be there even as you remember the story. And so how does that happen? It happens by practicing at first, and then it becomes second nature to you, by practicing when a person talks to you or you're looking at them, not to think while you look. Now, how do you do that? Thinking is kind of obsessive for many people. I bet you're obsessive, and they think if they stop thinking, they die, or they have no idea what's going on anymore. They feel totally lost if they can't interpret every moment. And there's this obsessive need also to interpret every person that they meet, immediately formulate opinions which are all just reflections of your past conditioning. In many cases, totally unreal. In some cases, there may be some correlation with what you're looking at and what you're judging. But whatever you're judging in the other person is the story and the conditioning of the other person, never the essence of who that being is. So it's only by refraining from thinking. How do you do that? Well, use the inner body as an anchor while you're looking. Feel the aliveness. That's one way of being present. And then you look, and then you become the spacious awareness. And this is the greatest gift you can give another human being, is to give pure attention to another human being. And there's no longer any intention, egoic intention, what can you do for me? Or what did you do to me last year you shouldn't have done? Or what does she want from me? All kinds of stories that interfere with true relationship. So as I look at you, and you look at me, and I can sense and feel that you experience, you realize right now what I'm talking about. There is the presence in you. You are not judging me. And this is a wonderful gift. It feels, the other person feels liberated because intuitively they know they are not being judged. Now, usually you don't get that from human beings. You only get it from your dog. And that's why it's so lovely to look into the eyes of a dog. It's so heartwarming, because the beingness speaks through unobscured by mental stuff. So the beingness speaks through the eyes of the dog, and by looking into the eyes of the dog, you feel really very alert. Why do you love? Well, except one or two of you who might have a phobia because you got bitten when you were 5, but most. Or you can take a cat too, but let's.
This doesn't work as well.
No, let's talk about dogs. There is something when you look into the eyes of a dog, you go, For a moment it frees you from your mind, and you can sense the beingness, and you can recognize. Now you might not know this, but the reason why people love looking into the eyes of the dog or touching the dog is they realize their own beingness more when they look into the eyes, because there's a consciousness in the dog. What you love in the dog is not the fur, although it might be nice and warm to touch it. What you love in the dog ultimately is not the physical form, and what you love in another human being, of course, the same way. You love the consciousness of the dog. And when you look into the dog's eyes, the consciousness shines through. And by acknowledging that, it arises in you, and that is the function of animals living with humans. It's a spiritual function that they have. And the same can happen with humans. It requires more presence to look at another human without thought, because often from other humans you get judgment. So more intense presence is required, but it's a beautiful practice. So there's always 2 dimensions in you. There's the personal dimension, mental formations, emotional formations, feelings, the limited self, and there is the spacious being self. The 2 are conducting a dance. And so the mastery of life is to have both active, to acknowledge the world of form, the world of stories, the world of personalities, and the physical world, but at the same time not be confined and trapped only in that dimension, to also have what I sometimes call space consciousness, to know yourself also and more essentially as the space for it all. Sometimes it's called stillness, whatever pointer you want to use. I'm talking for too long, I know, but just one more thing. You're
reading me well.
You can compare yourself for a moment. The analogy you can give to yourself. I've done it. You may have listened to me give it before, but it's always fresh and new to me. So I'll say, let's say you are this room, and you want to know yourself. So if you are this room, let's say the ceiling, the floor, the walls are your physical body, and the content is this room is the content of your mind, the mental, emotional accumulations, your mind. Now, most people only know themselves as that. So this room then knows itself only as the ceiling, the floor, the walls, and the furniture, and all the stuff in the room. If I ask the room, is there more to you than the stuff that is in here and the walls and the ceilings? The room would say, no, that's me. It's the stuff in here. And the room is then overlooked that the room essentially is space. The essence of this room is not what's in it. The essence of this room is what enables the stuff to be in it. It's the space. And if the room discovered its essence, identity as space, that would be awakening. That's the end of the analogy. So
it's lovely. It's lovely. I want to stay on story and stillness for another minute and extend the complexity. One thing many of us, I think, struggle with is when you extend out then between 2 people to a family or a team of people who work together regularly, any kind of system where you not only have the individual story, but the collective story. So I'm the joker and you're the critic, or whatever roles we play, that the system, in a sense, often reinforces those roles.
Yes.
And they take on something larger than life and difficult to change, so that even some behavior change isn't seen in the system. So if we assume that not everyone in the system is practicing at stillness, or maybe they are, but they're at different places in their process, how does an individual in a system become more genuinely there freshly each time against the power of the dynamic? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes. So in other words, you're surrounded by people who are still identified to a large extent with their mental accumulations.
Mental accumulations about themselves and
that's right.
And you and each
they
other.
play roles which they may be unconsciously playing. So, and those may be either people you work with, or they may be family members. The hardest test and the most important test, or one of the most important tests to find out whether you are able to practice presence and live it rather than only experience presence when you go. Or even exert willpower so that you mustn't think.
You're clenching your fist.
The real test is often family members, people with whom you share a lot of past, because so much has accumulated and so many opinions and of judgments of who you are have accumulated in family members' minds. So there it requires really intense presence, as the Ram Dass, of course, as you know, said, if you think you're so enlightened, go spend a week with your parents. And that's very true. And I experienced that in my life, to have a lot of resentment about my dad, some about my mom, but more about my dad, because he had terrible anger issues. Now, mostly the anger wasn't directed to me, most of it went to my mom, but that was just as painful. And even when I was a young adult, I had lots of resentment built up against his insensitive and sometimes violent behavior. And then when the shift in consciousness happened, it felt very liberating. I was able to see that not only he, but every human being cannot act beyond their level of consciousness. So compassion suddenly came in, although at first I didn't know that that's called compassion. It just meant I didn't have a grievance anymore, and I actually felt love towards him and realized he did what he did at that time. His level of consciousness did not allow him to behave any differently. So I was able to forgive without having to go through a mental act of forgiveness. It just happened. And a strange thing happened then. His ego, which was very strong, part of it crumbled. Another part remained strong until the end of his life, so depending what situation he was on. But suddenly there were things, spiritual truths occasionally came through him. The moment I gave up my resentment towards him, something in him shifted. There was not a total shift, it never was. Some of the ego was very obnoxious to the age of 90 when he passed away, but something deeper also came through, and that was a miraculous thing to say. And then he came up with wonderful, sometimes in some areas he suddenly his behavior was virtually enlightened. He would never complain when he was waiting somewhere. He said, oh, fine, I can wait. It doesn't matter how long it takes. I can be here an hour, half an hour, 2 hours. I don't mind. And then he had, like me, he almost never went to see a doctor, but he had lots of little ailments, and he came up with great wisdom sayings like, I live in pacific coexistence with my illnesses. When he said that, I went, wow. A spiritual master talking. So that was the shift. And then at work, of course, let's say at a meeting, it may well be that you are the only one who has any realization of presence. Now, a little danger here is, of course, the thought arises in your mind, not in yours, but it could happen to somebody else.
Somebody else's.
A thought arises in your mind that you are superior to these because you are spiritually realized. And then you have to somehow teach them. And if that thought arises in your mind, of course, you're going to experience a lot of frustration because you're not going to teach them anything. But you can be in a particular state, and I will recommend that you practice in non-critical situations. Which non-critical situations are looking at a dog, a tree, the sky, and realize what it means to be present in that situation.
I'm taking away the advice that we start with trees.
Yes.
Non-critical situations.
The trees have no accumulated
Right.
ideas about you. They don't talk back to you. And so trees are wonderful beings. They are beings. So, and they're very still. They don't make any noise except when it's windy, but that's a very lovely noise. They're very still. They are very rooted, of course. They are rooted, and they are just, and some are there for hundreds of years, and they are just, if they made a noise, they don't make a noise, but if they made a noise, it would be a bit like the Om. Wonderful energy there. So that's a great help in being present. And then you graduate, and then you're present with people you meet casually at the supermarket. People you ask at the information counter, at the airline counter, or somebody was talking earlier today about the flight attendants and so on. So there you practice presence. You look at them, and you don't reduce them to a role, but realize you can sense their beingness. But you can only sense their presence if you can sense your own presence. It's only through that you can go look beyond the personality, which may be obnoxious, in some cases it is, may be very difficult, and then it gets challenging. So then you practice with brief encounters, which is beautiful too, and then you go into their workplace, and then you begin to practice there. Be the presence in a meeting, the next meeting. Continuously be aware of your state of consciousness. Hold that presence if you can, without any willpower. It's not through willpower. Presence simply arises, and some of you are at the point, many of you are at the point where you can actually choose to be present. And then you look around the room, and one person starts talking. And you give your complete attention to that person. And this is a wonderful thing to be able to do, to give your complete attention to that. You neither argue with him mentally, nor do you need to prepare the next thing to say. You're just present. And then you may find that when you begin to speak, words will begin to come out of your mouth, and they will be inspired. And you will say something that is relevant, fresh, and new, and will not contribute to the conflict in that situation. So you're not fueling the conflict. And even if others are beginning to fight, that you need to be really alert not to get drawn in, because the egoic unconsciousness of a group can be has an extraordinarily powerful pull. And it can sometimes happen that in a group or meeting, one unconscious person can pull the entire group into unconscious reactivity and negativity. Just one unconscious goes, and then everybody else loses presence, even if they tried before. So it's contagious, but the good thing is presence is also, in a good sense, contagious. So presence also affects people around you. So wonderful practice, meetings, and so on are great places. I can hear a phone ringing somewhere.
I think it's behind us.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, this is the world we live in.
This is the world we live in.
Well, maybe it's my phone. No, it isn't. Time to take a selfie.
That's lovely.
And post it on Facebook.
Yeah.
This is me in, where are we? San Francisco.
What does it mean when the most present person on the planet says, "Where are we again?" It means that you're in our conversation and in our conversation.
We are here. That's all we need to
here.
know.
That's lovely. That's wonderful. Well, I think we should talk a little bit about devices,
Yes.
given that exchange. And I have to tell you all, I did have the honor of being seated at the table next to Eckhart at dinner a couple of years ago, and I kept thinking, well, first of all, I have to put all my devices away and make sure they're all turned off, because that would just be awful if anything happened. And then I thought, I wonder, if you live as a Luddite, I wonder if you actually live device-free, and you probably have people who read email for you and take phone calls for you, because how else can you be fully in the now? And so I had this sort of image, my story about you. It was flattering, but it was, elevated a bit. And yes, exactly, exactly. And so we're talking at some point, and we got to talking about dogs, because we are both deep dog lovers. And all of a sudden, you said, "Well, let me show you a picture of my dog." And out comes the phone and the dog with Kim. And we sat.
I love dogs.
Love dogs, and I took out my phone then a little bit sheepishly, and we exchanged pictures of dogs. And so I said, okay, well, that preconceived notion is gone. You actually have a phone, and it's a smartphone, not like an old phone, and you use it, and there's pictures on it. And so you became quite human in that moment to me. I already admired you. You just became even more human then. So we live in this device world, and you do too. And so we're here in part because of the intersection of technology and our wisdom practices. And technology can be helpful, but it often isn't, and can be distracting. And you spoke about that during your meditative lecture, I'll call it. How's that as a label?
Yes.
So how have you navigated the temptation of device distraction, and how can we collectively learn how to continue to stay present? It's really part of the essence of this conference, is how do we live in this digital age? Some of your thoughts on that.
Well, I am connected now to the digital world, but not as much as most people, I must admit. I have a cell phone, and I have a first-generation iPad, and and I have the iPad Mini too, which Kim gave me for my birthday, and I enjoy them. I get emails, but not in the way that most people get emails, because most emails go to the office, and only a few people. I really admire Ariana, who earlier today gave you all her email address, and I must admit I'm not going to do that.
Fair enough.
One reason being, although it might be good practice for you, but one reason being is it's unlikely that you would get an answer, and that would be good practice for you to say, oh, no answer, rather than building a story around it. This is a similar, if I may just diversion, sometimes people send me books, well, not sometimes, I am drowning in manuscripts and books that people send me, and I was the same when I wrote The Power of Now. Somebody said, you must send this book to Deepak and to Oprah, and I said, okay, I'll send it. Of course, I didn't get any answer from Deepak or Oprah at first. They don't actually look at the books. They can't. They are drowning in stuff, so they cannot look at these things. Fortunately, I didn't have an ego that would indulge in saying, they didn't even bother to reply to me. Who are they? They pretend to be enlightened and didn't even bother to send me a little card. Isn't that a lovely story for the ego? The ego loves getting in there and saying, yeah. But it was fine, they didn't answer, and that's all, and it was fine. And 2 or 3 years later, the book reached them in some way, but not because I sent it to them. So the universe somehow arranged it. So people have stories quickly about things like that. So no emails, because you probably wouldn't get an answer. And those few people who have my email address, most of them know that they may or may not get an answer. And they're fine with it. I use sometimes texting, which I quite enjoy, not obsessively, but I use it from time to time with people. And as I mentioned 2 years ago, perhaps already, I sometimes enjoy sending a space message rather than a text message, which goes like this. You press on open bracket, you have an empty space, you go, then you close the bracket, and then you send it. And when that person receives it, their phone goes bing, or whatever it does, and they go, oh, a message without content, pure space. So, and then later I found a term for it, spacing. So I recommend it, but I would talk to the people beforehand to say that you might get a space message from me, otherwise they won't know what's going on. Yeah. So I also noticed that there is an addictive quality to these things. There's to the internet, and there's an addictive quality to all these gadgets. There's already an addictive quality to watching television, which was a thing before all these gadgets came. Television was the main psychologically addictive thing, and people were glued to their sets. But now, with all those, we need to be aware, and several speakers have, of course, gone into it in more detail than I can. There are enormous possibilities of connectedness and the dissemination of information in our digital age. There are wonderful possibilities opening up, and some people are fully using, like Ariana, and so people are fully using, and Oprah, they're fully using the possibilities that this offers, reaching people and getting the message out. But there are also enormous dangers for, as I mentioned a little earlier, the stuff that people identify with as themselves, and the incessant stream of thinking, that, of course, that wasn't created by the digital devices, but it's being the addiction to stuff, the addiction to the next thought and the next, and having to go wherever it wants to pull you, which is an unconscious addiction. Really, I call it the addiction to thinking. Usually when people talk about addiction, they don't think of thinking, but thinking for most people, is addictive, and because and it's toxic in many cases. So it's like a drug. Because why is it a drug? Because their sense of who they are is bound up with thinking. They've got to think about my life. There's no such thing as your life, except as a story in the head. Life is now. You are life. You are that. So the gadgets, they amplify that tendency that was already there for thousands of years. So the next thing, they tend to fill your mind up even more with one thing after another. Facebook, Twitter, text message, email, web surfing. It all comes in and you have to, and the mind reaches there. Whatever thing demands the mind's attention, the mind immediately goes there. Mm-hmm. And at night, it's wonderful that Ariana said she has a bedroom that is free of devices, and that's a wonderful practice. There you have to create a space. We need some discipline. Otherwise, the technology, which has enormous potential, may destroy us. I don't know, if you look at the children, young children, no longer interacting with their peers, their parents, they don't, physical movement, many become obese at 5 years of age because they don't move anymore, and their mind gets sucked into the devices. And they feel if you take it away from them, they experience enormous pain in the same way that an addict experiences pain when you remove the drug. He goes, give me my iPad, can't live with my iPad. And other attention deficit disorder comes in of can't focus on anything for very long because these gadgets are one image flashes one after another. So if you want to write a dystopian science fiction novel, dystopian, as you know, meaning a negative utopia, I would suggest write technology, new technology arises, it has an addictive effect, the generation that's growing up grows up with it, it prevents people from focusing attention for anything for very long, which is a prerequisite for coming up with anything creative, is to become still, go within, and then creative solution comes. So a generation grows up that is completely out of touch with their inner being. They can no longer find creative solutions to problems because the deeper place where creativity arises is not accessible to them anymore, and 2 or 3 generations later, the entire civilization collapses. This is a dystopian novel which you can write as a warning for what could happen, but this is a good sign, the fact that we are here. Yes. It's not going to go that way, but it could.
Right. It seems to me there are two potential problems that are interrelated, and one is the presence of the devices themselves, which we've talked about, and practicing discipline. And as you say, a number of speakers have talked about rituals, in a sense, or habits or rules for themselves that allow discipline around when and how to use them. And the other is that the devices essentially just bring one's work closer, but the work is a different kind of pressure, and I think we have a room of people, many of whom are extremely committed to the work that they're doing, the careers, their professions, the world-changing work or the device-creating work, but it's or both in the same person. There's a level of pressure and excitement and ambition and so forth. And so if you imagine the person who works in the sort of competitive, fast-paced, very exciting technology environment, how do you integrate stillness into that in a way that doesn't feel like you have to choose to step off the train? You know, can you be still and be in an environment that is as wild as that?
Yes, that's very challenging. Of course, to realize that if you don't find the space within where the stuff of your mind is transcended, then sooner or later you will encounter suffering, a lot of suffering, and you will burn out, and you will no longer have any creative ideas, and you will just maybe try to problem solve. So you need to realize, first of all, the importance of, for yourself, it is more important, as has been said today by various speakers, much more important than what you achieve in this world, because it's all relative, and nothing is going to last for that long. Much more important than what you achieve is the awakening within you, the awakening of consciousness, knowing who you are beyond all that, knowing what we could call the transcendent dimension to who you are, which goes back thousands of years in human spirituality. They've all pointed to it in different ways, in different words. And if you don't realize that is the most important thing in your life, then you're going to become unhappy if you're not unhappy already. Some young people have a residue of vitality, so they might not be unhappy yet, but then they use that up, and then they become very unhappy because they've never found anything beyond the stuff of their minds. And that is a terrible fate. So that is why this is so important. So that requires then some decisions perhaps and discipline on your part, so that you do not allow those things to take over your life in the same way that you do not allow your mind to take over your life. And of course, in many cases, even long before these digital gadgets, the human mind has tended to take human beings over and say, this is who I am, me, the story self. So it requires discipline and some kind of perhaps even a routine, one being what was suggested earlier, not to engage in communication through like emails between a certain time period, whatever it may be, evening and morning, so that at night when you wake up you don't go there. And for your children also create space, only allow them, you probably cannot totally take it away from them because it's in the culture, it's everywhere, but create a structure so that for a certain amount of time, and don't let the children get lost in the digital world. It's a terrible fate. Don't allow the dystopian novel that I just mentioned to become reality.
Right.
It will become reality if you allow your children to get totally lost in the digital realm, so that becomes more important to them than the life. They can no longer relate to a tree. We come back to trees. They can no longer relate to the river. They cannot. Sensory experience disappears from their lives, and it's all concepts and digital images. It's a terrible
It's a distressing thing. So I'm not going to let you end on the dystopian novel, but our friends with the ringing phone have told us we've used our extra time.
Oh, okay.
I know, it went quickly. So rather than end on the dystopia, can you tell us briefly, where does your hope come from? So we can end with a sense of hope.
My hope comes out of this moment, being here with you.
Should I have known that?
So